It waits for the noise to die down, for the masks to slip, for the mind to exhaust itself with its own games. Then it whispers, not in words, but in ache, a deep, unmistakable ache for something more, not more success, not more approval, but something more real, more whole, more alive. This ache is not a mistake. It is not depression. It is not dysfunction. It is the call, the sacred signal that you are ready to leave the lie behind. But here's the truth. Most people hear this call and pretend it's nothing. They silence it with achievement. They drown it with distraction. They medicate it with routine, because to answer the call means losing the world you built on sand. And maybe that's the part no one tells you. The moment you finally touch truth, it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like collapse. The scaffolding of your life crumbles. The stories you repeated for safety dissolve. The masks you wore so long they became your skin fall away, and you stand there, raw, exposed, trembling, as if the universe itself just asked you, are you ready to wake up? Most people are not. Most people retreat. Most people run back to the dream, because awakening is not gentle. It is not romantic. It does not caress you into bliss. Awakening shatters. It breaks the shell. It tears through illusions so violently that the old self screams in protest. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain, and in these first moments, you understand exactly why. The ache that pulled you here will not let you go back, and yet, it doesn't yet show you where to step forward. You are caught in between worlds, the old one fading, the new one not yet formed. This is the threshold, and as you stand at its edge, you realize why most people never survive their spiritual awakening. Not because it kills them, but because it asks them to die, while still breathing, to let go of the identity they spent a lifetime protecting, to step into a wilderness that the rational mind cannot map. And here you are, listening now, feeling something stir inside you. Perhaps you know exactly what I mean. Perhaps you felt the whisper in your chest, the sacred ache in your bones. If so, stay with me, because in this journey, we are going to descend together into the shadows, into the silence, into the fire that strips away the false, until only what is real remains. This is not a story of light alone. It is the story of darkness and of the self that survives it. This is the story of why most people never survive their spiritual awakening, and why, if you do, you will never be the same again. The collapse of the ego. Awakening does not arrive as comfort. It arrives as crisis. It begins the moment the life you've built starts to feel like a lie. Not a malicious lie, but a necessary one. A scaffolding that once protected you from truths you weren't ready to face. But now, something ancient within you is ready. And so, the walls begin to crack. The identity you polished for years suddenly feels foreign. The roles you played, the achievements you clung to, the stories you told yourself about who you are, all begin to unravel. It's as if the very foundation of your life was made of sand. And now the tide is rising. You try to hold it together. You try to tape the pieces back in place. But the more you cling, the faster they crumble. This is what Carl Jung meant when he said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Awakening doesn't flatter your ego, it destroys it. Think about it. Your entire life you've been taught to succeed, to conform, to fit neatly into the expectations of others. You were trained to wear masks, to bury your truth, to silence your wildness, and you survived. Of course you did. The persona kept you safe, safe enough to belong, safe enough to function. But now, the persona begins to suffocate you. The mask that once saved your life has become the prison of your soul. And when that mask slips, even for a moment, you feel something terrifying. A silence, so loud, it drowns out the voice you once called me. This silence is ego death. Not a metaphor, not a mystical abstraction, but the very real psychological death of an identity. And if you resist it, it hurts even more. If you fight it, it feels like madness. If you surrender, it still tears you apart. But in the tearing, you glimpse something eternal. This is why most people never survive it. Because the old self doesn't go quietly. It screams, it bargains, it clings to every familiar label, every comforting illusion. It tells you, you're not awakening, you're broken. You're not evolving, you're depressed. You're not transforming, you're delusional. And maybe you even believe it, but only because the map you were given was never designed to lead you to yourself. It was designed to lead you to safety, to conformity, to approval, never to wholeness, never to truth. So the scaffolding collapses, and what feels like destruction is actually initiation, a sacred invitation to let go of everything that isn't real, every label, every borrowed identity, every mask that became your skin. You will lose things, you will lose people, you will lose versions of yourself you swore were permanent. And if you try to drag them into the new frequency, they will rot in your hands. Awakening doesn't give you a shinier version of your old life. And it burns the old life to the ground and waits in the ashes to see what, if anything, dares to rise. And still, most people turn back. They choose comfort over truth. They choose applause over authenticity. They choose the cage they know over the wilderness they don't. But you, if you're listening this far, perhaps you are beginning to feel it. The tremble, the unraveling, the rawness of a self you no longer recognize. This is not the end of you. It is the end of who you were never meant to be. So breathe. Let the scaffolding fall. Let the mask slip. Let the ache guide you deeper. Because only when the false self collapses can something true emerge. Not built from fear, not crafted for approval, but born from essence. And essence does not shout. It waits. It waits for the noise to die down, for the masks to slip, for the mind to exhaust itself with its own games. And then it whispers again. The same ache, calling you deeper into the fire. This is the first step. The death before rebirth. The breaking before becoming. The fall that opens the path to the soul. The descent into shadow. You are told that awakening is light, but that is only half the truth. The other half lives in shadow, and the moment you pierce the veil, the world begins to dissolve, not physically, but existentially. The meaning you once assigned to everything collapses. Who you thought you were collapses. Your beliefs, your gods, your goals, suddenly echo hollow in a chamber you can no longer live inside. This is the shadow's domain, not the shadow of nightfall, but the shadow within you, the part of yourself you denied, the part you exiled, the part you tried so desperately to forget. And now, it returns. It shows you everything you buried, the rage, the grief, the fear, the manipulations, the ways you controlled because you never felt safe, the ways you betrayed yourself just to survive. This is the shadow, and it does not arrive as an enemy. It arrives as a long-lost part of you, begging to come home. But here is the difficulty. The shadow does not speak kindly. It speaks in triggers. It speaks in projections. It speaks in pain. It shows up in the ways you sabotage what you most desire. It lives in your jealousy, in your defensiveness, in your addictions. And until you face it, until you turn toward it, you remain trapped in the loop. This is what so many do not understand. Awakening is not the end of suffering. It is the beginning of facing it, consciously, honestly, radically. And that is why so few make it through. Because the descent asks everything of you. It asks for your grief. It asks for your rage. It asks for your silence. It asks you to be reborn with no promise of who you'll become. It asks you to die while still breathing, to lose your mind, to find your soul, to watch the scaffolding collapse and say yes anyway. The ego fears this descent because the ego was built on control. Control of perception, control of emotion, control of story. It was crafted to survive in a world that punishes vulnerability. But the soul does not care about survival. The soul came here to become, and becoming requires unmaking. You must unmake the armor, unmake the stories, unmake the scaffolding that told you who to be. Only then can something true emerge. And in the silence after unmaking, something stirs, not a voice, but an ache, a deep, unmistakable ache for something more. Not more success, not more validation, but more real, more whole, more alive. This ache is not a mistake. It is not depression. It is not dysfunction. It is the call, the sacred signal that you are ready to leave the lie behind. But most people hear the call and pretend it's nothing. They silence it with achievement. They drown it with distraction. They medicate it with routine, because to answer the call means losing the world you built on sand. And no one warns you how lonely that is. The first stage of descent isn't beauty, it's exile. Exile from the familiar, exile from the socially acceptable self, exile from the matrix of validation you didn't even know you lived inside. And in that exile, you will want to go back. You will crave the numbness, the predictability, the comfort of pretending. But something in you won't let you, not anymore. Because once you've glimpsed truth, you cannot unknow it. So you wander through nights without sleep, through mornings filled with tears you cannot explain, through relationships that feel hollow, even when no one did anything wrong. This is the space between selves, the cocoon, the void, the liminal zone, where everything old has died and nothing new has yet taken root. It is terrifying. It is sacred. It is where the soul does its deepest work. And here, the shadow comes closer. No longer content to be denied, it shows itself in every trigger, every reaction, every unhealed wound, rising to the surface like a scream from the deep. And you want to run. Of course you do, because you were taught to run from pain, to fix it, to spiritualize it, to override it with affirmations and positive thoughts. But awakening is not a bypass. It is a confrontation. It is an unflinching look into the mirror of your own fragmentation. You are not asked to escape the pain. You are asked to meet it, to sit with it, to feel it, to let it teach you what comfort never could. Slowly, you begin to see the pain was never the enemy. It was the doorway, the crack in the shell, the fault line where the light could enter. The anger, the sadness, the fear. They were never broken pieces. They were buried messengers, each carrying a fragment of your truth. And as you listen, you soften. You begin to feel something you haven't felt in years, maybe ever. Compassion, not just for others, for yourself, for the child in you who was never held, for the teenager who built armor just to survive, for the adult who confused productivity for purpose. You see it now, all of it, with tenderness, with grace. And in that grace, something shifts. The void and the exile. The first stage of awakening is not beauty, it is exile. Exile from the familiar, exile from the socially acceptable self, exile from the matrix of validation. You didn't even know you were living inside, and this exile feels like death, not the death of the body, but the death of belonging. Suddenly, the places that once welcomed you feel foreign. The conversations that once entertained you now feel empty. The people you once resonated with begin to drift away, and you ask yourself, what's happening to me? Why does everything feel so hollow? But this is the nature of exile. You are no longer at home. In the world you built from illusion, in this stage, you crave to go back. Back to the numbness, back to the predictability, back to the comfort of pretending. You remember how easy it was to silence the call with achievement, to drown it in distraction, to medicate it with routine. But now, the call is louder, the ache is deeper, and something in you refuses to go back to sleep. So you wander through nights without sleep, through mornings with tears you cannot explain, through days where laughter feels forced and silence feels unbearable. This is the void, the in-between, the space between selves. The old identity is gone, the new one has not yet formed. You are suspended in the cocoon, and it is terrifying, because the void is vast. The void is silent. The void offers you no map, no certainty, no guarantee. Here, language begins to fail you. You try to speak, and words feel too small. You try to plan, and the future laughs at you. You try to hold on, but there is nothing left to grip. The void strips you bare. It takes away the crutches. It dismantles the scaffolding, and it asks you to stand in nothingness. Most people cannot endure this stage. They mistake the void for failure. They label the exile as depression. They run back to the comfort of distraction. But the void is sacred, because here, in the silence, the soul does its deepest work. The void is not punishment, it is preparation. It is the space where illusions die and essence begins to breathe, and yet it feels unbearable. You feel like a ghost in your own life. Friends speak to you, and their words pass through you like smoke. You walk into a room and feel invisible. You scroll through the noise of the world, and every image feels hollow. You begin to wonder, am I losing my mind? But the truth is, you are losing the mind you were given, the conditioned mind, the trained persona, the false identity. What you are losing is everything that kept you asleep. In exile, you begin to see yourself clearly, not the polished version, not the curated persona, but the raw self, stripped of roles, stripped of armor. And this rawness feels unbearable, because the world trained you to hide it. The world taught you that vulnerability is weakness, that silence is failure, that not knowing is shameful. But in exile, those lies are exposed, and you begin to realize what you thought was weakness is actually the soil of becoming. The void breaks you open, so something real can take root. But here's the paradox. You cannot force it. You cannot rush it. You cannot demand that the new self arrive. You can only stay. Stay in the silence. Stay in the ache. Stay in the emptiness. And trust that in this holy nothingness, something true is being born, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to feel it. Not certainty, not clarity, but a shift, a softening, a presence, a whisper beneath the noise. It says, let go. Let go of the timeline. Let go of the blueprint. Let go of the need to know. Let it shape you. Let it strip you. Let it show you what remains when nothing is left to protect. And what remains is not your persona, not your performance, not the identity you spent years polishing. What remains is breath, presence, the deep pulse of being alive without needing to prove it. And in that moment, you meet yourself. Not the self you hope to become, but the one who was always waiting, the wild one, the wounded one, the one who remembers why you came here, before the world taught you to forget. This is exile. This is the void. It feels like loss, but it is the beginning of return. Not return to the old self, not return to comfort, but return to essence. The exile is not the end of awakening. It is the womb of awakening. And if you can stay long enough to endure its silence, to hold its emptiness, then you will see the void is not nothing. The void is everything. The rebirth through surrender. The descent does not ask for your strength. It asks for your surrender. And that is what terrifies the ego most, because the ego was built on control. Control of perception, control of emotion, control of story. It was designed to protect you in a world that punished vulnerability. But the soul does not care about control. The soul came here to become, and becoming always requires unmaking. So what does it mean to surrender? It means laying down the armor you thought you couldn't live without. It means letting the stories unravel, the ones you repeated so often they felt like truth. It means letting the scaffolding collapse until you stand naked before life itself. No titles, no masks, no borrowed identities, just you, bare, trembling, yet somehow more real than ever before. Surrender feels like dying, because it is the death of the false self. The death of who you thought you were, and in that death, something miraculous happens. You begin to feel not weaker, but freer, not empty, but spacious, not lost, but unbound. The chains fall away, the lies burn to ash, and in the stillness that follows, a whisper rises, not a command, not a demand, but an ache, a deep, unmistakable ache for something more real, more whole, more alive. This ache is not punishment, it is the invitation to be reborn. But here's the paradox. Rebirth does not arrive with fireworks. It does not announce itself with clarity. Rebirth happens quietly. In the moments when you stop fighting, when you stop bargaining, when you stop running. It happens when you allow yourself to be undone. You see, surrender is not giving up. It is giving in, not to despair, but to truth. It is the radical act of trusting the unknown, trusting that the collapse was not chaos, but creation. Trusting that the void is not absence, but womb. Trusting that what is dying is only what was never real. And in this trust, something shifts. You no longer cling to the old life. You no longer beg the past to return. You no longer demand certainty from the future. You begin to breathe differently. You begin to walk differently. You begin to feel lighter. Not because your circumstances have changed, but because your relationship to them has. The storms still come, the shadows still rise, but you are no longer drowning. You are watching, you are listening, you are allowing. This is the rebirth through surrender. It does not make you invincible, it makes you real. It does not make you perfect, it makes you whole. And wholeness is not the absence of shadow, it is the integration of it. You begin to see your rage, and you no longer fear it. You see your grief, and you no longer deny it. You see your fear, and you no longer run from it. You hold them, you listen to them, you let them teach you, and in that allowing, they transform. The shadow that once felt like a curse becomes a guide. The pain that once felt unbearable becomes a doorway. The exile that once felt like loss becomes your initiation. This is how the soul is reborn, not by transcending the human experience, but by inhabiting it fully, by saying yes to the fire, yes to the breaking, yes to the silence, and yes to the mystery of becoming. And from this, yes, a new kind of strength emerges, not the strength of control, not the strength of performance, but the quiet strength of someone who has faced the fire and stayed. Someone who has died to everything false and now lives from essence. This strength does not shout. It does not need to. It simply is. Rebirth through surrender is not the end of awakening. It is the threshold. The moment when you stop abandoning yourself and begin to trust yourself. The moment when you realize you do not need to know the path. You only need to stay on it. And as you walk, something begins to bloom, not instantly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The soul, slowly, begins to remember itself. The power of integration. Awakening does not end with rebirth, it begins with it. Because once the old self has collapsed, once the void has stripped you bare, once surrender has cracked you open, now comes the real work. Integration. Integration means this: bringing together what you once tried to separate, the light and the shadow, the broken and the whole, the human and the divine. It is no longer about escaping your wounds. It is about listening to them. It is no longer about bypassing your pain. It is about letting it teach you. Integration is not glamorous. It is not something you can post about. It is something you live, quietly, daily, courageously. The shadow still rises. It still speaks in triggers, in jealousy, in fear. But now, you no longer exile it. You invite it in. You say, "Sit with me. Tell me what you need me to know." And in that listening, the shadow softens. What once showed up as sabotage begins to reveal itself as protection. What once erupted as rage begins to show itself as grief. What once looked like weakness begins to whisper its strength. This is the alchemy of integration. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the task, to make the darkness conscious, to bring awareness to what was hidden, to bring love to what was unloved. And when you do, something miraculous happens. You stop needing to perform. You stop needing to be perfect. You stop needing to convince anyone of who you are. Because you know in your bones, you know in your breath. Integration is not about becoming better. It is about becoming honest. Honest about the mess, honest about the beauty, honest about the paradox of being human, terrified and eternal, wounded and limitless, fragile and unbreakable. And somehow, this honesty becomes your ground, not confidence, not certainty, but truth. From this truth, your life changes. You no longer build relationships out of fear of being alone. You no longer sell your soul for approval. You no longer abandon yourself in the places that hurt the most. You begin to live differently. You speak differently, not louder, but clearer. You say no without guilt. You say yes without over-explaining. You stop apologizing, Shabadin, for being whole, and the world does not know what to do with this version of you, because the world trained you to conform, to shrink, to fit in. But now, you are a frequency it cannot predict, a truth it cannot distort, a presence that awakens others, simply by existing. This is the power of integration. It is not performance, it is embodiment. Not talking about awakening, not preaching about healing, but living it, breathing it, becoming it, in every unguarded moment. And it does not always look poetic. Sometimes it looks like crying in your car, because your nervous system is rewiring itself. Sometimes it looks like losing people you thought were forever, because your truth became too loud for their silence. Sometimes it looks like grieving a life you built with love, because you built it from a version of yourself that no longer exists. Integration costs you. You don't just lose illusions, you lose identities, you lose comfort, you lose the scaffolding that once held you together and now holds you back. But what you gain cannot be taken away, because what you gain is you. Not the polished self, not the curated self, not the self you tried to sell to the world, but the self who was always there, waiting beneath the rubble, waiting beneath the rolls, waiting beneath the shadow. And when you begin to live from that self, life feels different, not easier, but truer. You no longer chase meaning like a ladder. You embody meaning as a way of walking, a way of loving, a way of staying soft when life demands you harden. And in that softness, you discover strength, not the strength of control, but the strength of presence, the quiet power of someone who no longer abandons themselves. This is integration, the marriage of opposites, the dance of shadow and light. And from this dance, something new is born. Not perfection, not enlightenment as you imagined it, but wholeness. And wholeness is the real miracle, living as the embodied self. Integration is not the end of the journey. It is the doorway to embodiment. Because awakening does not ask you to talk about truth. It asks you to live it, not in grand gestures, not in spiritual performances, but in the ordinary moments, the moments when no one is watching. Living as the embodied self means this: you no longer outsource your worth to approval, to systems, to roles. You no longer betray your inner knowing just to be liked. You no longer dilute your depth to keep others comfortable. Instead, you walk as truth. You breathe as presence. You move as someone who is no longer split inside. Embodiment is quiet. It doesn't need attention. It doesn't need applause. It shows up in how you speak, in how you say no without guilt, in how you say yes without shrinking, in how you stop explaining yourself to those who never truly listened. This is the power of embodiment. It is not about what you claim. It is about what you radiate. And here's the paradox. Living as the embodied self is not always beautiful. Sometimes it looks like shaking in your car as your nervous system rewrites itself. Sometimes it looks like walking away from people you loved because your soul outgrew their silence. Sometimes it looks like grieving the life you thought you wanted because it was built from a false self. But in every loss, you gain alignment, and in every ending, something true is allowed to live. The embodied self does not strive for love. It remembers it is love. The embodied self does not chase purpose. It lives as purpose, in the way it listens, in the way it breathes, in the way it refuses to abandon itself again. And this presence changes everything, without preaching, without pushing, without trying to convince. You simply exist. and your existence becomes a mirror. Some will look into that mirror and shatter. Others will look and awaken. But your task is not to manage their reflection. Your task is to remain the mirror, to remain the fire, to remain the clarity. Embodiment is not about waking others up. It is about staying awake yourself, and that is enough. Living as the embodied self means you stop rushing your becoming. You stop begging for clarity. You stop fearing the unknown. Because now, the unknown feels like home. You walk through life, not searching for proof that you matter. You walk as proof. Not proof for the world. Proof for your own soul. Proof for the part of you that remembers what it cost to reclaim your voice. This kind of strength is not loud. It doesn't need to shine the way the world measures power. It is sovereign. It is unshakable. It is the strength of someone who has already died to everything false. And because you have died to the lie, you cannot be broken by the truth. So what does it look like to live as the embodied self? It looks like resting without guilt. It looks like feeling without shame. It looks like speaking without shrinking. It looks like walking through the world without needing to explain your existence, because your existence is no longer a question, it is an answer. Living as the embodied self is not about becoming more. It is about becoming you. All of you, the holy, the messy, the broken, the healed, the unhealed, the becoming, all of it, finally allowed. And when all of you is allowed, life becomes quieter, but fuller, not easier, but truer. This is embodiment, the place where awakening stops being a story you tell and becomes the life you live. Not because you mastered it, not because you transcended it, but because you stayed. You stayed in the fire. You stayed in the silence. You stayed through the breaking, and in staying, you became someone true. This is living as the embodied self, the quiet strength of presence. True power does not announce itself with noise. It does not flex. It does not shine the way the world has taught you to measure strength. True power is quiet. It is steady. It is presence. Once you have walked through the fire, once you have died to everything false, something remarkable happens. You stop performing. You stop proving. You stop chasing the validation you once thought was survival. And in its place, you discover a strength that cannot be shaken. Not because it cannot break, but because it has broken and returned in deeper form. The quiet strength of presence is not about control. It is not about dominating others. It is not about forcing the world to bend to your will. It is about standing in who you are, without apology, without performance, without fear. You no longer need the world to see you, because you have seen yourself. Presence means this: you walk into a room, and without a word, something shifts. Not because you are louder, but because you are clearer. Your very being reflects what others have forgotten, and sometimes that reflection awakens them. Sometimes it unsettles them. But you no longer bend yourself to manage their response. You simply remain. You remain the mirror. You remain the flame. You remain the truth. This is the strength of someone who has stopped running, who has stopped abandoning themselves, who has stopped trying to hide their depth for the comfort of others. It is not glamorous. It is not dramatic. Sometimes it looks like silence, while others argue. Sometimes it looks like stillness, while others scramble. Sometimes it looks like a soft gaze, when the world demands hardness. But make no mistake, this softness is not weakness. It is power, the kind of power that cannot be faked. Presence disarms illusions. Not because you try to expose them, but because you simply refuse to feed them. You no longer participate in the games of validation. You no longer sell your time for applause. You no longer dilute your truth to belong. And without your participation, the illusion cannot survive. This is the quiet revolution of presence, not to fight the system, but to stop fueling it with your energy, not to preach change, but to embody what cannot be denied. And here's the paradox. The more you embody presence, the less you feel the need to explain it. You don't shout, "I'm awake." You don't force others to join you. You simply live awake. And that alone is enough. Some will be drawn to your clarity. Some will resist it. But either way, you remain unmoved. Because presence is not about outcome. It is about alignment. Living from presence means you no longer rush. You no longer beg for clarity. You no longer fear the unknown. The unknown becomes home. You no longer ask, "Who am I supposed to be?" You whisper, "I already am." And from that whisper, life becomes quieter, but richer, not measured in applause, but in alignment, not measured in achievement, but in truth. This is the quiet strength of presence. It is the strength of someone who has surrendered, who has integrated, who has embodied. Someone who has touched the fire and did not run. Someone who now walks through life, not searching for proof that they matter, but walking as proof. Proof to their own soul, proof to the child within, who was once abandoned. Proof to the truth, that they have finally come home to themselves. And in this presence, you discover the deepest freedom of all. You no longer need to escape the human experience. You are here to inhabit it, fully, consciously, boldly. This is not the strength of the ego. This is the strength of the soul. And once you live from it, you are unshakable. Not because life gets easier, but because you no longer abandon yourself when life gets hard. This is the quiet strength of presence, the simplicity of a true life. When you finally come home to yourself, life becomes quieter, not easier, but simpler, because you no longer waste energy trying to be what you are not. You no longer build relationships out of fear of being alone. You no longer sell your time for the cheap currency of praise. You no longer dilute your depth to be accepted in shallow spaces. You have met yourself too deeply to pretend again, and in that meeting, simplicity is born. The simplicity of a true life is not minimalism on the surface. It is honesty at the core. It is waking up in the morning and not needing to put on a mask. It is speaking from your soul instead of rehearsed scripts. It is resting without guilt. It is feeling without shame. It is loving without fear. This simplicity is not about doing less. It is about being more real. And in this simplicity, you notice something. The moments that once felt insignificant become sacred. A quiet cup of tea, a slow walk in the evening, a genuine laugh shared with someone who truly sees you. These are no longer filler moments. They are the fabric of life itself. Because when the noise dies down, when the masks fall away, what remains is presence. And presence makes even the smallest moment holy. The world will still tempt you. It will still try to pull you back into performance. It will still whisper, be more, achieve more, prove more. But something in you has shifted. You no longer chase the mirage. You understand now that more success does not equal more aliveness, that more approval does not equal more wholeness. What makes you alive is honesty. What makes you whole is truth. And truth is simple. Living a true life does not mean you will never feel pain again. You will. It does not mean you will never face loss again. You will. But pain no longer defines you. Loss no longer destroys you. Because you no longer abandon yourself. In those places, you meet the pain, you honor the loss, and you stay present. This is the difference. This is the simplicity. And in this simplicity, you discover a freedom you never knew. You don't have to strive to belong because you already belong to yourself. You don't have to chase purpose because you live as purpose. You don't have to search for love because you remember you are love. What once felt like a curse, the unraveling, the exile, the silence, now feels like grace because it brought you here, to this stillness, to this clarity, to this truth that nothing outside of you can ever give or take away. Now you watch others, you see them running, performing, chasing shadows of belonging, and you don't judge because you were there, because you still carry the scar, but you also carry the light, not the kind that blinds, the kind that beckons, the kind that says, you're allowed to stop running now, you're allowed to feel, you're allowed to come home to yourself. Some will hear that light in you and awaken. Others will turn away. And that's okay, because the simplicity of a true life is that you no longer need to save anyone. You no longer need to convince anyone. You simply live. You simply stay awake. You simply remain real. And that is enough. This is the simplicity of a true life. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but true. A life where you no longer abandon yourself. A life where you no longer chase illusions. A life where you inhabit the human experience. Fully, consciously, unapologetically. And that simplicity is the greatest richness of all. The final threshold. Awakening is not a single event. It is not a mountaintop moment where everything becomes clear. It is a rhythm, a return, a remembering. And yet, there comes a threshold, a moment when the deepest truth finally lands, not as a concept, not as an idea, but as your lived reality. The final threshold is this. You no longer ask, who am I supposed to be? Instead, you whisper, I already am. And that whisper changes everything, because you realize awakening was never about becoming more. It was always about becoming you, all of you, the holy, the messy, the divine, the wounded, the healed, the unhealed, the becoming, all of it, finally allowed. You stop fighting with yourself. You stop rejecting the parts you once exiled. You stop bargaining with life to only give you what feels easy. You begin to say yes to all of it. This is the threshold most people turn away from because it asks for everything. It asks you to stop abandoning yourself, even in the places that hurt the most. It asks you to trust that even in the breaking, you are whole. It asks you to believe that even in the silence, you are heard. It asks you to embody that even in the unknown, you are home. Crossing this threshold is not about transcendence. It is not about escaping the human experience. It is about inhabiting it fully, with all its contradictions, with all its paradoxes, with all its unbearable beauty. You realize you were never meant to be flawless. You were meant to be real. You were meant to be here, alive, awake, present. And once you cross this threshold, life becomes less about seeking and more about being. You stop striving for love because you know you are love. You stop searching for purpose because you live as purpose. You stop chasing meaning because you embody meaning in the way you move through the world. Every breath becomes a prayer. Every step becomes a practice. Every moment becomes enough. The final threshold is not a destination. It is not a finish line. It is a way of walking. You walk lighter. You walk softer. You walk freer. Not because life has become simple, but because you have become simple. You no longer split yourself in two. You no longer abandon yourself for safety. You no longer hide your soul for someone else's comfort. You are whole, and wholeness cannot be shaken. This is why so few survive awakening, not because they can't, but because they turn back too soon. They feel the ache and call it dysfunction. They touch the void and call it despair. They glimpse the shadow and call it sin. But you have stayed. You turned inward. You turned toward. You turned into yourself. And in that turning, you found home. The final threshold is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming who you have always been. The wild one, the wounded one, the eternal one, the one who remembers. And once you live from that place, you no longer seek awakening. You live awake, not as a performance, not as an identity, but as presence. This is the final threshold. You have walked with me through collapse and shadow, through exile and void, through surrender, integration, embodiment, and presence. You have felt the ache. You have faced the silence. You have touched the fire. And if you are still here, still listening, it means you have not turned back. You stayed. Awakening is not about becoming better. It is about becoming true. True to the self that was always there, waiting beneath the rubble of illusion. True to the soul that remembers why it came here. And that truth is unshakable. Not because it never breaks, but because it has broken and returned whole. So now, the invitation is yours. To walk, not to chase, but to radiate. Not to prove, but to be. To let your very presence become a mirror. To let your life become a quiet revolution. To stay awake when the world begs you to sleep. This is the gift of awakening. Not that it removes the pain, but that it teaches you how to remain present through the pain. Not that it saves you from fire, but that it shows you how to live as fire. If these words have touched something in you, I invite you to share your story. What has your soul whispered to you in the silence? What masks have you shed? What truths have you dared to face? Leave your reflections in the comments below, because your story might be the mirror someone else has been waiting for. And if you wish to keep walking this path together, subscribe to this channel. Share this video with those you feel are ready. Let us build a space where truth is not performed, but lived, because this journey is not meant to be walked alone. We are mirrors for one another. We are guides for one another. We are companions in the wilderness. So let us stay. Let us remain awake. Let us embody the truth that cannot be shaken. And together, let us live as the awakened. This is the end of the story, but it is only the beginning of becoming.